There's something about snow at night that changes the rules. Sound disappears. Distance lies to you. And when something moves out there, you can't tell if it's far away or already close enough to know your name. Every story you're about to hear in this video is 100% true, pieced together through public records, police reports, and first-hand witness accounts. Some names have been changed to protect privacy, but what happened in these snowy nights is completely real. Before we continue, make sure you like this video. It helps these stories reach more horror lovers like you. Comment where you're watching from. You're part of my horror family, and I want to know where my family is watching from. And after the video, comment which story hit you the hardest. If you're new here, subscribe. Your support fuels this channel and allows me to bring you even more true, unsettling stories like these. Now, listen carefully. Snow hides more than footprints. I don't like telling this story because it makes me sound paranoid, like I'm trying to turn a bad night into something bigger than it was. But the truth is, nothing about it ever settled back into place for me. I still drive different roads when the weather turns. I still keep my phone face down in the car, like it can't watch me that way. That winter, I'd been working a contract job outside Beckley. The kind of temporary thing you take because it pays a little better than staying put. My apartment was down near a little town outside of Hinton, tucked into one of those hollow valleys where fog hangs low in the mornings and the woods press close enough to make the place feel smaller than it is. I'd been gone all week, sleeping in a cheap motel that smelled like old carpet and fryer grease. On Friday, I finally pointed my truck back toward home. The Appalachian Mountains can feel friendly in the daylight. Ridgelines like waves, bare trees throwing lacework shadows across the road. But at night, in bad weather, those same hills turn into something else. The pass I took cut between two long slopes, steep on both sides, with rock faces that dripped even when it wasn't raining. That night, snow came down heavy and wet, the kind that sticks to your windshield in clumps and turns everything into a blur of gray. By the time I hit the higher elevation, the world narrowed. Just my headlights, the lane lines disappearing under fresh snow, and the dull roar of wind in the trees. My wipers scraped like they were tired. The radio kept losing signal, fading in and out between static and a preacher's voice. I was still 20 minutes from the turnoff that would drop me down into my hollow when I saw brake lights ahead, smeared red through the storm. At first, I figured it was a wreck. People slid off those roads all the time. I eased up and stopped behind a line of cars that looked like a string of red beads laid along the mountain. Snow piled on hoods and roofs, almost as soon as we stopped moving. The engine's heat made the air over my hood shimmer, then disappear into fog. 5 minutes passed, 10. The brake lights stayed on, steady, like no one wanted to risk letting go. I watched the snow thicken, watched it build along my side mirrors. I tried calling out, but my phone had one bar that kept flickering away. I could have gotten out and walked up the line, but the wind had teeth and the snow was already soaking into my jeans through the door seams. I told myself it would start moving any minute. An hour went by. The longer we sat, the more the whole line of cars felt wrong. Too quiet, too still. No one honked. No one stepped out to smoke. Just idling engines and the steady tick of falling snow. Occasionally, a car door would open a crack and shut again, like someone changed their mind. I could see silhouettes behind windshields, heads turned forward. Nobody looked at anybody else. That's when I noticed him. At first, he was just a darker shape moving through the storm, coming from the front of the line toward the back, drifting in and out of my headlights' reach. He walked close to the cars, hunched against the wind. He didn't have a flashlight, just a hood pulled up and his hands stuffed in his pockets. Snow stuck to his shoulders, melting and darkening the fabric. He stopped at each driver's window and knocked softly, like he didn't want to startle anyone. I leaned forward, squinting through the streaked glass. The man's knocking was so gentle, it looked almost polite. But no one rolled their window down. No one even turned their head. I watched a woman in a sedan 2 cars ahead stare straight through her fogged windshield, as if she couldn't see him standing inches from her face. Her hands were locked around the wheel. When he knocked, she didn't flinch. He moved on. My first thought was that he needed help. Maybe he'd been in an accident. Maybe he was cold and desperate. I reached for the window controls, then stopped. Something about the way he walked, steady, patient, didn't match someone panicking in a blizzard. He wasn't waving his arms. He wasn't trying to flag anyone down, just knocking, leaning close, and moving on when he was ignored. I looked around at the other cars. Every driver seemed frozen in the same posture, eyes forward, shoulders tight, like there was an unspoken agreement in that line. Don't engage. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe they all knew something I didn't. Maybe he was drunk, maybe he'd been bothering people. Maybe there'd been warnings about someone out here, in those mountains. You hear stories about folks who set up breakdown traps, or kids running scams at night. People say a lot of things. Most of it is just fear dressed up as advice. Still, when he got closer, my mouth went dry. He stopped at a pickup beside mine first, knocked twice, and waited. The driver didn't move. The man tilted his head as if listening, then walked on, straight toward me. He came into the full wash of my headlights, and I saw his face for the first time, pale, wet from snow, with a short beard darkened by melting flakes. His eyes looked tired, not wild. That somehow made it worse. He lifted his hand and knocked softly on my driver's window. Tap, tap. I stared at him, my fingers curled around the steering wheel, feeling the rubber texture under my gloves. The heater blew lukewarm air that smelled faintly of damp wool and old coffee from the cup holder. My heart beat slow and heavy, like it was trying not to make noise. He leaned down trees until his mouth was close to the glass. I could see the shape of his breath fogging a small circle. And in a voice I could barely hear over the wind, he whispered my full name. Not just my first name, not the shortened version people use. The full thing, first, middle, last, like it was being read off a document. I didn't answer. I don't know why. Maybe because I couldn't. Maybe because every instinct I had screamed that if I acknowledged him, something would change in a way I couldn't control. His eyes stayed on mine, steady, patient. Then he straightened up and walked past my truck into the snow, continuing down the line of cars as if nothing had happened. I sat there shaking, trying to make sense of it. My name wasn't on my vehicle. My license was in my wallet. I hadn't spoken to anyone. I hadn't even gotten out of the truck. The line of cars remained silent. Engines idled. Snow fell harder. And it felt, quietly, unmistakably, like I had just been singled out. After he passed, I kept expecting someone to finally react. A door to open, A window to crack, someone to shout, "Hey, who the hell is that?" But nothing happened. The red line of brake lights stayed steady and unmoving, and that was almost the worst part. It made me feel like I'd done something wrong by noticing. I sat there another 10 minutes, then 20, barely breathing. I kept looking in my mirrors, trying to catch a glimpse of him moving between the cars behind me. All I saw was swirling white and the dim glow of headlights. The storm swallowed everything. My phone showed no service. I tried dialing anyway. Just pressing call like that would somehow force it to connect. The screen stayed frozen on calling until it gave up. When I looked up again, the truck ahead of me finally rolled forward a few feet. The movement was so sudden it made my stomach drop. Then the car in front of it moved, like some invisible hand had loosened a knot. I followed, easing the truck along, tires crunching through fresh snow. The line started crawling forward at a walking pace. Nobody honked. Nobody sped up. Just a slow, obedient procession down the pass. As we moved, I searched for signs of an accident. Flashing lights, cones, a state trooper's SUV. There was nothing. No wrecked car in the ditch. No blocked lane. No fallen tree. The road just opened again, like it had never been stopped. I kept expecting to see the man up ahead, stepping off into the woods, disappearing where the mountains swallowed the road. But there was no sign of him. The cars never changed their behavior. It was as if the entire line had agreed, without words, to erase him. I told myself there had to be a rational explanation. He might have been someone from the motel earlier in the week, someone who saw my name on a check-in sheet. That idea didn't fit. Why would he be out here, miles away in a storm? He might have been a tow operator, an off-duty deputy, somebody who ran plates. That didn't fit either. No uniform, no vehicle, no urgency. The most logical thought, the one I hated, was that I'd spoken my name without realizing it. Maybe I'd called my voicemail. Maybe I'd muttered it when I was frustrated. But even that didn't explain how he said it like a fact. Not a guess, not a question. By the time I dropped out of the higher elevation and into the lower valleys, the snow shifted to freezing rain. The world turned glossy and dark. Water ran off the bare branches in thin streams. Fog rose from the road like breath. The mountains pressed closer, their sides invisible in the mist, and the hollows became deep pockets of darkness between scattered porch lights. I should have gone straight home. I should have locked my door and tried to sleep. But my hands wouldn't stop trembling, and my mind wouldn't stop looping back to his face at my window. So I did what people do when they're scared and don't want to admit it. I went looking for proof that it had been normal. There was a little gas station near Sandstone, the kind with a single row of pumps and a bell that jingles when you walk in. I pulled in, parked under a buzzing light, and just sat there for a minute listening to my engine tick as it cooled. Rain tapped the roof. Somewhere beyond the lot, a dog barked once and went quiet. Inside, the air smelled like coffee that had been burned, left too long, plus the sour tang of mop water. A man behind the counter watched an old TV mounted in the corner. The screen showed weather warnings scrolling across the bottom. I didn't want to sound crazy, so I kept it simple. "Road was backed up on the pass," I said, setting a few bills down for gas. "Any idea what happened?" He looked at me for a second, just long enough to make my skin prickle, then shrugged. "Snow," he said. "Folks stop when they get spooked." "That's it? No wreck?" He shook his head, eyes already drifting back to the TV. Ain't heard nothing. I almost let it go. Almost. Then I asked the question that had been clawing at my throat. Have you ever seen a guy walking between cars up there? Knocking on windows? His gaze snapped back to me. Not surprised. Not confused. Just guarded. Like I'd said something he wished I hadn't. He didn't answer right away. He picked up my money, slid it into the register, and closed the drawer with a soft click. Don't stop on that pass, he said finally. If you can help it. That's not what I asked. He stared past me, toward the window, where rain streaked the glass into warped lines. People get ideas, he said. When they're stuck, they start thinking they saw things. I saw him, I said, my voice lower than I meant. And he knew my name. For the first time, the man behind the counter looked genuinely uncomfortable. He rubbed his palm over his jaw like he was wiping something away. Names ain't hard to get, he said. Not if someone wants him. That should have been reassuring. It wasn't. It made my stomach tighten. Like the world had shifted into a shape where that sentence was normal. I paid, fueled up, and drove the rest of the way home, with my headlights cutting through fog and rain. The hollow where I lived was quiet, except for the constant drip of water from the trees. My cabin wasn't old by Appalachian standards, but it had the same feel. Wood that held cold in its grain, floorboards that creaked in familiar places, a faint smell of damp earth that never fully left in winter. I locked the door behind me. I checked the windows. I stood in the kitchen, listening to the refrigerator hum and the rain rattle the gutters. Only when I set my keys down did I notice something that made me go still. My keyring wasn't the way I remembered it. There were 4 keys instead of 3. The extra key was old brass, worn smooth, the kind that belongs to a padlock or an antique door. I stared at it, turning it between my fingers. It was cold, like it had been outside for a long time. I told myself I'd picked it up by accident. Maybe it was stuck to my ring somehow. Maybe it belonged to the motel keychain and I'd absent-mindedly clipped it on. But I hadn't used a key at the motel, just a plastic card, and this key looked older than anything modern. I tried it in my front door lock. It didn't fit. I tried it in the deadbolt. Nothing. Then I remembered the small shed behind my cabin. A rotting little structure the landlord had told me not to bother with. Full of junk, he'd said. Door swelled shut years ago. I hadn't thought about it since. I put on my coat and stepped out into the wet night. Fog hung low over the yard, thick enough that my porch light felt weak and far away. Mud sucked at my boots as I walked toward the shed. The woods around my property were quiet in that heavy way they get after a storm, like everything is holding its breath. The shed door was exactly as I remembered. Warped, gray wood, a rusted hasp with a padlock that looked ancient. I slid the brass key into the padlock. It fit perfectly. My fingers shook as I turned it. The lock gave with a soft, almost gentle click, like it had been waiting. The door didn't swing open easily. It stuck, then creaked, releasing a smell that hit me like a mouthful of rot. Mold, wet paper, old animal nesting, and something metallic underneath it all. Inside was darkness and clutter. Broken tools, rotted boxes, a mildewed tarp slumped over something large. My porch light barely reached, so I used my phone flashlight, the beam cutting through dust and damp like a knife. That's when I saw the photos. They were pinned to the wall on the far side, held up with rusty nails. Polaroids and printed snapshots, edges curled from moisture. At first, I couldn't make sense of them. Just dim shapes of cars on a mountain road, brake lights glowing red through snow. Then my light landed on one that made my throat close. It was my truck, same dent on the rear bumper, same faded sticker in the corner of the back window. The photo had been taken from the shoulder of the pass, angled slightly upward, like whoever took it had been standing in the snow watching the line of cars. Pinned beside it was another picture, closer, taken at window height. A man's reflection in my driver's side glass, leaning in. I stared until my eyes burned. I could see, faintly, my own face inside the cab, lit by my dashboard. Frozen, wide-eyed, there were more photos, different storms, different years, different cars. All of them stopped on that same pass. All of them with a figure moving between them, knocking on windows. Some had names written on the back in black marker. Full names. I don't remember leaving the shed. I remember the feeling of my heart beating too hard, the wet air in my lungs, the flashlight beam shaking so badly. The photos seemed to move. I remember locking the shed again with hands that didn't feel like mine, stumbling back to the cabin like I was walking through a dream. I didn't call the police. I didn't know what I'd even say. That I found a wall of photos in a shed I'd been told to ignore? That one of them was me? That a man on a snowy road whispered my name? I didn't sleep. I sat on my couch until morning with every light on, listening to the house settle and creak, listening to rain drip from the eaves like fingers tapping. The next day I drove to my landlord's place and asked him about the shed. He looked at me like he didn't understand the words. "What shed?" he said. I moved out 2 weeks later. I left most of my furniture behind. I told people it was because the place was too damp, too isolated. That was true, but it wasn't the reason. The reason is that sometimes, late at night, when the weather's bad and my phone buzzes with a new notification, I get a cold certainty in my gut that someone is keeping track of me the same way they kept track of those cars on the pass. And I still don't know the part that scares me most. Whether the man learned my name that night, or whether he'd known it long before I ever set tires on that road. I took the overnight maintenance job because it was quiet, and because I needed quiet. After my divorce, I couldn't stand the constant noise of town. Cars, neighbors, televisions through thin walls. I wanted something simple. Fix what breaks, keep the pipes from freezing, make sure the backup generator kicks on when it has to. The ski lodge sat high up in the Appalachian Mountains on the West Virginia side, tucked along a ridge above a place locals still called Slate Hollow. In winter, when the slopes were open, it was busy enough to feel like a real business. When storms rolled in hard, they closed the road gates, sent guests down the mountain, and left a skeleton crew to keep the building from dying. That crew was usually me. The lodge was older than it looked in the brochures. The lobby tried to be charming. Stone fireplace, heavy beams, mounted antlers, but the place always smelled faintly of wet wood and old carpet shampoo. In the back hallways where guests never went, the air was cooler and tasted like dust. Pipes sweated even in cold weather. The floors creaked in patterns you could learn if you stayed long enough. That night the forecast kept getting worse. By late afternoon, snow started coming down in thick slow flakes that didn't drift so much as settle, like somebody was pouring flour over the mountain. The last guests left just before dark, tires crunching on the packed driveway. The manager, a man named Walt, who always wore the same fleece vest, clapped me on the shoulder like we were friends. "Keep it warm," he said. "Storm's gonna sit on us." Then he drove away, taillights disappearing into the white. Once the gate was chained and the plows stopped coming, the lodge felt like it was holding its breath. The wind pushed against the walls with a low, steady pressure. Somewhere in the trees, something small, maybe a squirrel, maybe a branch, kept tapping the roof in irregular little thuds. Every so often, the building shifted and groaned like it was settling deeper into the mountain. I made my usual rounds. Boiler room first, then the laundry, then the basement where the old water heater lived like an animal in a cave. My flashlight beam picked up dust motes and the shine of damp concrete. The place always felt slightly too big at night, like there were extra hallways you didn't notice in daylight. Around 10, I checked the sealed wing again. That wing was on the 3rd floor, past a set of double doors with an employees only sign that had been there so long it was yellowed. In winter storms, they kept it shut to save on heat. That's what they told me anyway. Walt had been clear on the rule. Don't go in there unless there's a pipe burst or an alarm. "It's empty," he'd said. "It's nothing." The doors were locked with a keypad. My code didn't work. Never had. The first time I asked about it, Walt just said, "That's above your pay grade." Still, every time I walked past those doors at night, I noticed the smell. Not strong, not obvious. Just a thin thread of something like old smoke trapped in fabric. Like a campfire jacket that never fully aired out. I went downstairs and tried to ignore it. Near midnight, the storm thickened into something heavier, almost a roar. Snow smacked the windows in soft bursts. The power blinked once, just a quick flicker, then returned. I listened for the generator to kick on, but it didn't. The lodge held steady. The only sound was the vent fan in the utility room and the occasional pop of the radiator pipes. I was in the maintenance office, going through a box of spare radio batteries, when the security radio crackled. The lodge had an old handheld system. One radio for me, one for the manager on duty during peak season, one for security when they actually staffed it. Most nights in the off-season, the radio was just background noise, a reminder of rules. It would hiss sometimes, nothing else. That night, it spoke. At first, it was just static. Then a voice came through. Thin, clipped, like someone talking too close to the mic. 207. I froze with the battery in my hand, listening. Static again. Then clearer. 212. I stared at the radio like it had grown a mouth. I pressed the talk button without thinking. "Maintenance here. Who's on?" No answer. Just the hiss of dead air. Then 314. It wasn't a request. It wasn't, "Can you check room 314? It sounded like someone reading numbers off a list. Calm, routine. Like it was the only thing that mattered. A cold feeling crawled up my spine. Not fear exactly. More like a sudden awareness that I was alone and something had just noticed me. I set the radio down and opened the maintenance binder. The one Walt made me sign out at the start of each shift. It was full of checklists. Boiler pressure, water temps, emergency lighting. There was also an older logbook inside, thick and worn, its pages yellowed and wavy from moisture. Nobody had mentioned that book to me. It had been shoved behind the binder like an afterthought. I flipped it open and found entries in neat, dated handwriting. Most of it was normal. Replaced thermostat in 118. Ice machine leaking. But then I saw a section with heavier underlining, written years earlier. Fire, West Wing. My mouth went dry. Under it were room numbers, the same ones the radio had just spoken. Beside each number was a short note, nothing detailed, just blunt fragments. Smoke damage. Door warped shut. 2 occupants, unaccounted for. I read the dates twice. This wasn't last year. This was a long time ago. Long enough that the lodge had been renovated, repainted, and rebranded. Long enough that nobody on staff talked about it like it was part of the building's history. The radio crackled again. 207, the voice repeated, slightly slower now, like it expected me to understand. I felt the lodge around me in a new way then. The weight of it, the way the hallways funneled sound, the way old buildings held on to things. I tried to tell myself it was interference, some stray signal from a sheriff's channel or a snowplow crew. But those were room numbers, specific ones, the exact ones tied to the fire. The wind pressed hard against the windows, making the glass tremble. I put the old logbook back, like it might burn my hands, but the information didn't go away. It sat behind my eyes. I realized I had never been told about any fire. Not during training, not in passing, not as a funny story over coffee. That felt intentional. I looked up at the ceiling as if I could see through floors to the sealed wing above. Somewhere in the lodge, something clicked. Maybe a door settling, maybe a pipe. In the radio, static whispered like breath. I shut off the office light and stood in the dim glow from the hallway, listening for footsteps that never came. And for the first time since taking the job, I had the clear, quiet thought that the lodge wasn't simply empty. It was closed. There's a difference. I should have left the radio where it was and finished my rounds like normal. I should have waited out the storm and told Walt about it in the morning, let him shrug and blame the weather. Instead, I did what I always do when something doesn't make sense. I went looking for the part that had been hidden. The next call came at 12:17. 314, the voice said again. 314. I stood in the hallway outside the office with my jacket half zipped, flashlight in hand, listening so hard it felt like my ears hurt. The voice wasn't frantic. It wasn't playful. It was almost clinical, like a dispatcher marking locations. I walked toward the stairwell that led up to the 3rd floor. The lodge lights were dimmed in storm mode. The hallway, sconces casting warm little pools that didn't reach the corners. The carpet, patterned with fake pine trees, looked darker in the low light, like stains you hadn't noticed before. As I climbed, the air changed. It got cooler and drier, with that faint smoke and mildew smell I'd always noticed near the sealed doors. My boots made soft, absorbed sounds in the carpet runner. Everything else was quiet except for the building's distant humming and the storm battering the outside walls. At the top of the stairs, the employees' only doors waited. The keypad glowed a tired green. I tried my code again, out of stubbornness, denied. I stepped back and scanned the frame with my flashlight. The doors were solid wood, old and heavy. The hinges were newer than the wood itself, like they'd been replaced. Near the bottom, I noticed scratch marks in the varnish. Thin lines like someone had dragged something sharp across it. I crouched and ran my fingers over the marks. They weren't random. They were clustered near the seam where the doors met, like something had been pushed or pulled from the other side. The radio in my pocket hissed, then spoke. 212. The number landed in my chest like a stone. I didn't have the code, but I had keys. The lodge had a master ring for maintenance, mostly for supply closets and utility access. I'd never tried them on those doors because I'd been told not to. Now I slid one key after another into the narrow slot hidden beneath the keypad panel. The third key turned. Not smoothly, like it hadn't been used in a long time, but it turned. The latch clicked with a soft final sound. I stood there for a moment, hand on the handle, heart steady in a way that didn't feel brave. It felt detached, like my body had decided this was happening whether I wanted it to or not. When I pulled, the door opened an inch and stopped, as if the air itself was thicker in there. A smell rolled out, stale, sour, and unmistakably old smoke trapped in plaster. Under that was rot, the sweet dampness of mold and wet drywall. And on the floor, near what must have been the bathroom door, there were faint marks, scrapes in the wood, half circles and straight lines, like something heavy had been dragged repeatedly from one spot to another. I swallowed hard and stepped closer. The air smelled like damp ashes, even after all these years. In the bathroom doorway, the tile was cracked. The mirror had been removed, leaving adhesive streaks. In the tub, someone had left a pile of melted plastic, maybe old toiletries, maybe something else. I bent down, shining my light into the drain. Something pale caught the beam. Not bones, not anything dramatic. Just a small plastic item lodged in the grate. A key card sleeve, the kind hotels use for room keys. I pulled it free. The sleeve was brittle and stained, but printed on the front, faded yet readable, was the lodge logo, older than the current branding, and beneath it, handwritten in pen, E. Rutledge, 207. A name, someone's name, not just a number in a log. My stomach tightened with the sudden, intimate reality of it. This wasn't a story. This wasn't a rumor. Someone had stayed here. Someone had checked in, been assigned a room, slept, or tried to under this roof. I stood there, sleeve in my hand, listening to the silence. The storm outside was muted in this wing, like the building was buffering it. My flashlight beam trembled slightly. Then, from somewhere deeper down the hall, a soft sound carried to me. Not a voice, not footsteps. A gentle knock, 2 taps, tap tap. My skin went cold. I turned toward the open doorway of 207, aiming my light into the hallway. The beam reached only so far before darkness swallowed it. But I saw the plaques on the doors beyond. 212 farther down, and past that, the turn that would lead to 314. The radio in my pocket hissed and then went quiet, as if it had done its job. I didn't call out. I didn't move. I just stood there and listened, trying to separate normal building sounds from something else. The knock came again, slightly closer now, measured and soft, like a person trying not to wake someone. Tap, tap. Every practical part of me wanted to run, but another part, an uglier part, felt locked in place by something like shame. Because in that moment I understood what the lodge had been doing by sealing this wing and never speaking about the fire. And on the floor, near what must have been the bathroom door, there were faint marks, scrapes in the wood, half circles and straight lines, like something heavy had been dragged repeatedly from one spot to another. I swallowed hard and stepped closer. The air smelled like damp ashes, even after all these years. In the bathroom doorway, the tile was cracked. The mirror had been removed, leaving adhesive streaks. In the tub, someone had left a pile of melted plastic, maybe old toiletries, maybe something else. I bent down, shining my light into the drain. Something pale caught the beam. Not bones, not anything dramatic. Just a small plastic item lodged in the grate. A keycard sleeve, the kind hotels use for room keys. I pulled it free. The sleeve was brittle and stained, but printed on the front, faded yet readable, was the lodge logo, older than the current branding, and beneath it, handwritten in pen, E. Rutledge, 207. A name, someone's name, not just a number in a log. My stomach tightened with the sudden, intimate reality of it. This wasn't a story. This wasn't a rumor. Someone had stayed here. Someone had checked in, been assigned a room, slept, or tried to, under this roof. I stood there, sleeve in my hand, listening to the silence. The storm outside was muted in this wing, like the building was buffering it. My flashlight beam trembled slightly. Then, from somewhere deeper down the hall, a soft sound carried to me. Not a voice, not footsteps, a gentle knock, 2 taps, tap, tap. My skin went cold. I turned toward the open doorway of 207, aiming my light into the hallway. The beam reached only so far before darkness swallowed it, but I saw the plaques on the doors beyond. 212 farther down, and past that, the turn that would lead to 314. The radio in my pocket hissed and then went quiet, as if it had done its job. I didn't call out. I didn't move. I just stood there and listened, trying to separate normal building sounds from something else. The knock came again, slightly closer now, measured and soft, like a person trying not to wake someone. Tap, tap. Every practical part of me wanted to run. But another part, an uglier part, felt locked in place by something like shame. Because in that moment, I understood what the lodge had been doing by sealing this wing and never speaking about the fire. It wasn't to save heat. It was to keep the past from becoming real. I backed out of the room, slowly, my boots scraping wood that felt too fragile. I kept my flashlight fixed on the hallway, waiting to see a shape step into it. Nothing did. The air stayed still, but the knocking continued. Always just beyond where my light reached, moving with me like it knew exactly how far I could see. Tap, tap. I made it back to the double doors without turning my back. My fingers fumbled with the handle. When I pushed through into the lit, carpeted part of the lodge, the warmth hit me like I'd broken the surface of water. I slammed the doors shut and twisted the lock until it clicked. The lodge around me was the same as it had been. Lights humming, vents breathing, storm roaring outside. But I wasn't the same. I stood there for a long time, with my hand on the wood, feeling a faint vibration through it, maybe wind, maybe my own pulse. The knocking stopped. In the morning, Walt acted irritated that I'd called him early. I told him the radio had been acting up, that I'd gotten into the West Wing. I expected anger. What I got was something worse. A long, flat stare. Then he said, very quietly, "You didn't see anything." It wasn't a question. He didn't ask what I found. He didn't ask why I went in. He just repeated, slower, like he was giving me instructions. "You didn't see anything." I quit that day. Packed my truck while the snow still clung to the trees and the fog sat low in Slate Hollow. I drove down the mountain with my jaw clenched so tight it ached. But the lodge didn't leave me. Sometimes, when the weather turns and I'm alone at night, I'll hear a radio hiss even when there isn't one. I'll catch myself thinking in room numbers. I'll wake up with the smell of old smoke in my nose, like it's soaked into my lungs. And the worst part, the part I don't tell people, is that I kept the keycard sleeve from 207. I don't know why. Proof maybe, or guilt. Because every time I look at that faded name, I can't stop thinking about what it must have felt like to be trapped in a room while a building burned and everyone outside treated your door like something they shouldn't touch. I didn't see a ghost that night. I saw what happens when a place decides certain lives are easier to forget. And I'm not sure I'll ever fully stop hearing that soft, careful knocking in my head, like someone is still trying, politely, to be noticed. I moved to the cabin because I wanted to disappear for a while. Not in a dramatic way. I just needed distance from my job, from a relationship that had ended without a clean break, from the constant feeling of being observed, even when I was alone in a room. The cabin sat deep in the Appalachian Mountains, past a gravel road that turned into little more than two muddy ruts winding through hardwood forest. The nearest town was a faded place called Laurel Fork, 10 miles downhill, with one gas pump and a post office that closed before noon. The cabin itself had been built sometime in the 1950s. Single story, tin roof, a porch that sagged slightly in the middle like it was tired of holding its own weight. The wood siding was gray and splintered, soft in places where rain had gotten in and never quite left. Inside, it smelled like damp pine and old dust, no matter how often I cleaned. The floorboards creaked differently, depending on the weather. When it rained, they sounded swollen and irritated. When it froze, they went sharp and brittle. I like that, the predictability of it. The night the blizzard came in, I knew it would be bad. The radio had been warning about it all day. Heavy snowfall, high winds, possible outages. I filled the bathtub with water, stacked firewood near the stove, and charged my phone while the last weak bar of service flickered in and out. By dusk, the world outside had turned white and soundless, like the mountains had been wrapped in insulation. By midnight, the wind had teeth. It rattled the porch boards and drove snow sideways into the windows. The trees around the cabin groaned and clicked as they bent, branches knocking together like dry bones. I was sitting at the small kitchen table with a lantern lit, reading an old paperback when the lights cut out without warning. Just gone. The sudden silence was heavy. No hum from the refrigerator, no faint buzz from the overhead light, just the wind and the slow pop of the wood stove as it adjusted to the cold. I wasn't surprised. Outages were common up there. Still, I felt that familiar tightening in my chest. The one that comes when you're reminded how far you are from help. I lit another lantern and checked the doors. Both locked, windows latched, everything as it should be. I stood for a moment in the living room, listening. The storm pressed in from all sides, but the cabin held, the thick logs and old nails doing their job. That's when I noticed the light. At first, I thought it was a reflection, maybe my lantern bouncing off the glass, but it moved independently. A steady white beam sliding across the far wall, then disappearing. I stepped closer to the front window and wiped a clear patch in the fogged glass with my sleeve. Through the blowing snow, I saw a flashlight. It was outside, down near the edge of the clearing, moving slowly. Not bobbing like someone walking fast. Not jittery, controlled. It swept across the trees, then angled up toward the cabin. My stomach dropped. The beam paused on the front window, lingering just long enough for me to feel exposed, then moved on. I watched it trace the side of the cabin, stopping briefly at each window, like someone checking rooms. I ducked back instinctively, heart pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. My first thought was that someone was lost. Maybe a hunter caught in the storm. My second thought, quieter, colder, was that no one should have been able to reach my place in that weather without a vehicle, and there were no tire tracks in the drive. I grabbed my phone and tried calling the sheriff's department in Laurel Fork. It rang twice before going to a dispatcher who sounded tired and far away. I told her what I was seeing, keeping my voice low. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she exhaled slowly. "We can't get anyone up there tonight," she said. "Road's impossible. Best thing you can do is stay inside. Keep your doors locked." "What if they try to get in?" There was a pause. Then, "If you feel you're in immediate danger, call back. But until the storm clears, there's not much we can do." The line went dead. I stood there holding the phone long after the screen went dark. Outside, the flashlight beam reappeared, closer now. It stopped at the bedroom window, the one I slept beside every night. I stayed still. I didn't turn off my lantern. I didn't make a sound. I just listened to the wind and the steady crunch of snow being disturbed somewhere outside, muted by the storm. Eventually, the light moved away. I don't know how long I stood there after that. Minutes maybe. Long enough for my legs to ache from tension. When I finally worked up the nerve to look again, the clearing was empty. Just snow and darkness. The storm erasing everything as fast as it happened. I told myself it was over. That whoever it was had moved on. But when I lay down in bed later, fully clothed, lantern burning low, I couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin had been measured somehow. That someone now knew exactly where I slept. I didn't sleep. The wind kept me in a half-waking state. Every gust sounding like footsteps on the porch. Every creak of the cabin making my muscles lock. A few times I thought I heard something brush against the outer wall, slow, deliberate. But when I held my breath and listened, there was nothing but weather. By morning, the storm had burned itself out. The silence afterward felt unnatural. No wind, no falling snow, just a white stillness so complete it made my ears ring. Pale light filtered through the windows, reflecting off snowdrifts piled nearly halfway up the walls. I sat up slowly, stiff and sore, and waited. Nothing happened. After checking every room again, I pulled on boots and my heaviest coat. The cold hit me hard when I opened the door, sharp and clean, smelling like ice and pine sap. Snow blanketed the clearing in smooth, untouched drifts. The world looked reset. Too reset. I stepped down from the porch and immediately noticed the absence. No tracks. Not mine. Not anyone else's. The wind hadn't scoured the snow smooth. It was powdery and pristine, like it had fallen and never been disturbed. I walked slowly around the cabin, scanning the ground, my breath loud in my ears. Nothing. No signs of someone circling the house, no scuffs near the windows, no broken branches. Then I reached the back side of the cabin, near the tree line. There, clear as if it had been pressed deliberately into the snow, was a single set of footprints. They came from the woods, not wandering, not staggered. A straight, purposeful line from between the trees to the rear wall of the cabin. Each print was deep and clean, the edges sharp, like whoever made them had been heavy or careful, or both. I followed them, with my eyes heart-sinking. They stopped at my bedroom wall, Not the window, not the door, the wall itself. The final print was inches from the foundation. Toes pointed directly toward the spot where my bed sat on the other side. There were no return tracks, no signs of pacing, just the approach and then nothing. I stood there for a long time, trying to understand how that was possible. Snow doesn't erase only half of a trail. Wind doesn't politely remove the evidence of someone leaving while preserving their arrival. I pressed my gloved hand against the cabin wall, feeling the cold seep through the logs. On the inside, that spot lined up exactly with where my head had been when I lay awake listening to the storm. The realization settled into me slowly, like a weight. Whoever had been there hadn't needed to walk around the cabin to look for a way in. They already knew where to stop. I went back inside and locked the door again, even though it already was. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the lantern, its glass smudged with soot. The cabin felt smaller now, less like shelter and more like a box. I left that afternoon once the road was barely passable, tires crunching through churned slush and fallen branches. I didn't pack carefully. I didn't clean. I just needed distance between myself and that place. The sheriff's deputy I spoke to later was polite but unconcerned. People wander, he said. Storms do strange things to tracks. He suggested maybe I'd misremembered what I saw in the dark. I didn't argue. I sold the cabin that spring, cheap. Didn't ask questions when the buyer said he liked how remote it was. I didn't tell him about the footprints. Even now, years later, I wake up some nights with the same tight feeling in my chest, convinced there's light moving across my walls. I've checked weather reports compulsively ever since. I avoid places where snow piles high enough to hide details. Because what still unsettles me isn't that someone came out of the woods during a blizzard. It's that they came straight to me. And when the storm erased everything else, it left just enough behind to make sure I understood that part wasn't an accident.